The glass shattered before Eleanor Whitmore even understood what had happened. One moment she was standing near the long table of punch bowls, holding a tray for her sister Clara, and the next moment the tray was empty and red liquid soaked through the front of her gray dress. The ballroom around her went quiet, then loud, then quiet again in that terrible way a room goes quiet when everyone is trying not to laugh out loud. "Oh no," Clara said, pressing a gloved hand to her mouth. Her eyes were bright, not with worry but with something closer to satisfaction. "Eleanor, you clumsy thing, look what you have done to yourself." Eleanor looked down. The stain spread across her chest like a wound. She had worn this dress because it was the only one that still fit her properly, the only one not already promised to Clara or to Margaret for the season. Now it was ruined, and ruined in front of 300 guests at the Duke of Ashford's winter ball. "I did not do this," Eleanor said quietly. "You pushed the tray." "Do not embarrass yourself further," Margaret said, appearing at her sister's side as if summoned by the smell of trouble. Margaret was the eldest, the coldest, and the one who had spent years perfecting the art of saying cruel things in a voice soft enough to sound kind to anyone listening from a distance. A lady does not blame others for her own clumsiness. A few young women near the dessert table were already whispering behind their fans. Eleanor felt her face burn hotter than the stain on her dress. She had known, coming into this house tonight, that her sisters had planned something. She simply had not known what or how public it would be. She had been the family's afterthought for as long as she could remember. Clara was the beauty, promised since birth to marry well. Margaret was the clever one, sharp enough to run their father's estate herself if she had been born a son. Eleanor was neither. Eleanor was the one who mended the other two dresses when they tore, who wrote their letters when their handwriting grew tired, who stood behind them at every ball holding fans, gloves, and now, apparently, trays of punch that somehow always ended up on her. "Perhaps you should return home," Margaret said, and there was no mistaking the pleasure underneath her words now, "before you humiliate the family any further." Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, though she did not know what she would say. It did not matter. A new voice cut through the small crowd gathering around them, calm, unhurried, and impossible to ignore. "Is there a difficulty here?" The crowd parted the way water parts around a stone. Eleanor turned and found herself looking directly into the eyes of Edmund Blackwood, Duke of Ashford, the very man whose house they stood in, whose ball this was, and whose attention no one in the room had managed to hold for more than a passing moment all evening. He was looking at her, not at Clara, whose beauty usually drew every eye in a room within seconds, not at Margaret, whose sharp tongue made men nervous and curious in equal measure. He was looking at Eleanor, standing there with punch soaked through her dress and her sister's laughter still hanging in the air around her. "Your Grace," Margaret said quickly, stepping forward with a smile that had clearly been practiced in front of a mirror many times. "Forgive the disturbance. My sister had a small accident, nothing worth troubling yourself over." "I did not ask you," the Duke said, without any heat in his voice, which somehow made the words land harder than if he had shouted them. "I asked her." Eleanor felt every eye in the circle turn toward her at once. She had spent years learning how to disappear in rooms exactly like this one, how to become part of the wallpaper while her sisters shone. She did not know how to stand still while a duke waited for her to speak. "It was an accident, Your Grace," she managed. "I am sorry for the mess." "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. Then, before she could respond, he turned to a servant standing near the wall and asked for a cloth in a private room where the lady might repair herself without further audience. The servant hurried off. The circle of onlookers, sensing the entertainment had ended rather than begun, slowly began to drift back toward the music and the food. Clara caught Eleanor's arm before she could follow the servant. Her grip was tight enough to leave a mark. "What did you say to him before this?" she whispered. "Have you met him?" "No," Eleanor said honestly. "I have never spoken a word to the Duke of Ashford in my life." Clara did not look convinced, but there was no time to argue further. The servant returned with a cloth and gestured for Alina to follow him down a side hallway, away from the noise and the light and the eyes of everyone who had just watched her ruin herself in public. The small room she was led to was quiet and warm, lit by a single lamp near a window that looked out over dark gardens. Alina pressed the cloth against her dress, though she knew the stain would not truly come out, not tonight and perhaps not ever. She sat down on the edge of a chair and allowed herself, finally, to breathe. She did not hear the door open again until a voice spoke from just behind her. "You handled that better than most would have." Alina turned sharply. The Duke stood in the doorway, having apparently dismissed the servant somewhere along the hallway, and was now looking at her with an expression she could not quite name. Not pity, not amusement, something more careful than either. "Your Grace," she said, standing quickly and smoothing her ruined dress out of habit, though it did nothing to help. "I did not expect you to follow." "I own the house," he said, with the faintest curve of a smile. "I am permitted to walk its hallways." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with something Alina could not identify. Finally, the Duke spoke again, and this time his voice had lost its careless edge. "You are Alina Whitmore." It was not a question. Alina felt something cold move through her chest. "You know my name." "I have known your name for some time," he said. "Longer than tonight and longer than you might expect." Before she could ask what he meant, footsteps sounded in the hallway outside, quick and sharp, the sound of someone walking with purpose rather than leisure. A moment later, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face arranged into a look of polite concern that did not reach her eyes. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy so smooth it looked rehearsed. "Forgive me for intruding. I only came to see if my sister required any further assistance." "She does not," the Duke said simply. "But you may join us if you wish to understand something about your family that you do not yet know." Margaret's smile faltered just slightly, just enough for Alina to catch it. "I am not certain I understand your meaning, Your Grace." "You will," he said, "soon enough." Alina looked between them, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Something was happening here that she did not fully understand, something bigger than a spilled tray of punch or a ruined dress or a lifetime of standing in her sister's shadows. The Duke of Ashford had looked at her tonight the way no one had ever looked at her before, and he had known her name before she ever spoke it. Whatever this was, it had only just begun. "Perhaps," Margaret said carefully, her composure returning like a mask slipping back into place, "we should return to the ball. My mother will be looking for us." "Your mother," the Duke said, "is precisely who I intend to speak with next." The color drained from Margaret's face so quickly that Alina almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She remembered the punch, the laughter, the years of small cruelties dressed up as sisterly concern, and the sympathy died before it fully formed. The Duke turned back to Alina and his voice softened again, though his eyes remained steady and certain. "Come, there is a great deal I have wanted to say to you, and tonight, finally, I intend to say it." Alina did not know where this hallway led, or what waited at the end of it, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the strange and unfamiliar sensation of being the center of something rather than the edge of it. She followed him out of the small room and back toward the lights and the music, her ruined dress forgotten, her sister's laughter already fading from memory, replaced by something new and sharp and impossible to ignore. Behind her, Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, watching the two of them walk away together, and for the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing clever to say. The gardens outside the ballroom windows sat in darkness, but the light from the house spilled out across the frost-covered grass, and somewhere beyond that light, a carriage waited that would carry news of tonight far beyond these walls before the sun rose again. Alina did not know this yet. She only knew that the Duke of Ashford had chosen her, in front of everyone, and that nothing about tonight would be forgotten quickly, by her sisters or by anyone else who had watched it happen. As they walked back toward the main hall, the music swelled again and the guests turned to watch them pass. Whispers followed them like a current, quiet at first, then rising. Alina kept her chin lifted, the way she had taught herself to do through years of practice, though tonight, for the first time, she did not have to pretend the confidence. It was beginning to feel real. The Duke leaned slightly toward her as they walked, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "Your family believes they know exactly who you are," he said. "Tonight, they are going to learn how wrong they have been." Alina said nothing, but her heart pounded harder with every step, and somewhere behind the stained dress and the years of quiet obedience, something in her began, very slowly, to wake up. The night was far from over, and neither, it seemed, was she. The main hall of Ashford House had been built for exactly this kind of moment, with high windows and a floor polished so smooth it caught the candlelight and threw it back twice as bright. Alina had walked into that hall an hour earlier as no one, a name easily overlooked on any guest list. Now, walking beside the Duke with every head in the room turning to follow them, she understood that something had shifted, and there was no undoing it. Lady Whitmore stood near the musicians' platform, fanning herself with quick, nervous strokes, her eyes darting between her daughters as if trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces kept moving. When she saw Alina approaching on the Duke's arm, her fan stopped entirely. "Your Grace," Lady Whitmore said, her voice climbing half an octave higher than usual as she dropped into a curtsy. "What an unexpected honor." "Lady Whitmore," the Duke said, with the polite coolness of a man used to being obeyed rather than questioned, "I wonder if you might spare a few private words. There is a matter concerning your family that I believe has gone unaddressed for far too long." Clara arrived at her mother's side just in time to hear this, her earlier amusement replaced now with something closer to alarm. She glanced at Alina, then at the stain still drying on her sister's dress, then back at the Duke, as though trying to calculate how a spilled tray of punch had somehow turned into this. "Of course, Your Grace," Lady Whitmore said quickly, "anything you wish." The Duke led them toward a smaller sitting room just off the main hall, one clearly reserved for exactly this kind of private conversation, away from curious ears. Margaret followed a step behind, her earlier composure now replaced by a stiffness in her shoulders that suggested she already suspected what was coming, even if she could not name it. Once the door closed behind them, the noise of the ball fell away, replaced by the crackle of a small fire and the ticking of a clock on the mantel. The Duke did not sit. He stood near the window, his hands folded behind his back, and looked at each of them in turn before finally speaking. "3 years ago," he said, "I received a letter from a young woman I had never met. She wrote to me on behalf of a tenant family on my northern estate, a family whose home had been damaged in a storm and who had been denied assistance by my steward at the time, a man who believed poor families beneath his notice." Alina felt her breath catch. She remembered that letter. She had written it in secret, using stationery she had borrowed from her father's study, never once expecting a reply, let alone one that would matter. The letter was clear, direct, and free of the flattery most people use when writing to men of my position, the Duke continued. It did not ask for a favor. It stated facts, and it asked me to do what was right. I did. I dismissed the steward within the month and repaired the tenant family's home myself. Lady Whitmore's face had gone pale. "Your Grace, I do not understand what this has to do with." "The letter was signed E. Whitmore," the Duke said. "I assumed at the time that it came from your husband, or perhaps from an elder son. It was only much later, through a mutual acquaintance, that I learned Lord Whitmore had no sons, and that the letter had in fact come from his middle daughter." The room went very still. Clara's mouth opened slightly, though no sound came out. Margaret's eyes moved to Alina with an expression Alina had never seen on her sister's face before, something between disbelief and something sharper, something almost like fear. "I made inquiries after that," the Duke said, his voice steady and unhurried. "Quietly, discreetly, because I did not wish to cause trouble for a young woman who had done nothing but the right thing. What I learned was troubling. I learned that Eleanor Whitmore, the daughter who wrote to me with more clarity and courage than most men twice her age, was treated in her own household as something closer to a servant than a daughter." "That is not true," Margaret said sharply, before catching herself and softening her tone. "Your Grace, I am certain there has been some misunderstanding." "Is there?" the Duke asked. "Tonight, in front of 300 guests, I watched your sister blamed for an accident that was not her fault, mocked for a stain on a dress she wears because it is the only one not already claimed by the two of you, and told to leave my house in shame. I do not believe there has been a misunderstanding at all. I believe I have simply seen, with my own eyes, exactly what I was told to expect." Eleanor stood frozen near the fire, unable to speak. She had never imagined that letter, written in a moment of quiet anger years ago, would ever find its way back to her, let alone in a room like this, with her mother and sisters forced to listen to every word. "Your Grace," Lady Whitmore said, her voice trembling now, "I assure you, Eleanor has always been cared for as any daughter would be." "Then perhaps you can explain," the Duke said, "why she stood alone in a corner of your family's carriage while her sisters rode inside, on a night cold enough to freeze the breath in a person's chest. My driver mentioned it to me not an hour ago, having recognized your family crest as you arrived." Eleanor's cheeks burned. She had not known anyone had seen that, had not known it was worth mentioning to anyone at all. It had simply been the way things were, the way they had always been, for as long as she could remember. "She offered to ride outside," Clara said quickly. "She said she did not mind the cold." "A person does not offer to freeze because she enjoys it," the Duke said. "A person offers because she has learned, over years, that objecting will only make things worse for her. I imagine Eleanor has learned a great many things like that in this family." No one answered. The fire popped softly in the silence, and Eleanor felt every eye in the room, even her own reflection in the dark window glass, watching to see what she would do next. "I did not bring you here to shame you in private the way you shamed your sister in public," the Duke said, his voice finally softening slightly. "I brought you here because I intend to correct something that should have been corrected long ago, and I wanted you to understand why, rather than simply wonder at it." He turned to Eleanor then, and something in his expression shifted, the coolness of a moment ago replaced by something warmer, something that made her chest ache in a way she did not have a name for. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I would like your permission to call on you properly, as a suitor, beginning tomorrow. Not because of tonight's unfortunate accident, and not out of pity for what I have witnessed in this room. I would like to call on you because a letter you wrote 3 years ago told me more about your character than most people manage to reveal in a lifetime of acquaintance, and I have wanted to meet the woman who wrote it ever since." Eleanor's throat tightened. She had spent so many years disappearing into corners, into the edges of rooms, into the shadow cast by her sister's brightness, that she did not immediately know how to respond to being seen this clearly, this completely, by anyone, let alone a duke standing in his own sitting room with her mother and sisters as witnesses. "Your Grace," she finally managed, "you barely know me." "I know that you are honest even when honesty costs you something," he said. "I know that you defend strangers you have never met simply because it is right to do so. I know that you have spent years absorbing unkindness without complaint, which tells me you are far stronger than anyone in this room has given you credit for. I would like the chance to learn the rest." Lady Whitmore recovered her voice first, though it came out thin and uncertain. "Your Grace, if this is truly your wish, then of course the family would be honored." "I was not asking the family," the Duke said without looking at her. "I was asking Eleanor." All eyes turned to her again. Elena felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a second dress laid over the ruined one, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the choice being made in this room was entirely her own. "Yes," she said quietly, then again with more certainty. "Yes, Your Grace, I would welcome that." Something eased in the Duke's shoulders, a tension Elena had not noticed until it was gone. "Then it is settled," he said. "Tomorrow and every day after for as long as you will have me." Margaret's face had gone through several expressions in the last few minutes: disbelief, fear, and now something that looked almost like calculation, as though she were already trying to work out how to salvage her own position within a family whose middle daughter had just been chosen by one of the wealthiest men in the country. "Sister," Margaret began, stepping toward Elena with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "how wonderful for you. We are so pleased." "Are you?" Elena said. It was not quite a question. The room went quiet again. Margaret's smile faltered at the edges, and for once she had no clever response ready. The Duke offered Elena his arm, and this time, walking back out into the noise and light of the ballroom, she did not feel like a shadow trailing behind her sisters. She felt, for the first time in her life, like she was walking toward something rather than away from it. Behind them, in the quiet sitting room, Lady Whitmore turned to her two eldest daughters with an expression that mixed worry and calculation in equal measure. "We must think carefully," she said, "about how we conduct ourselves from this point forward." Clara said nothing. Margaret stared at the closed door through which Elena and the Duke had just walked, her mind already racing ahead to every possible way this new arrangement might be undone, redirected, or claimed for herself instead. But outside, in the golden light of the ballroom, Elena Whitmore danced for the first time in her life not as an afterthought, but as the center of the room, and she intended to remember exactly how that felt for as long as she lived. 3 days after the ball, a letter arrived at Ashford House that made the Duke set down his morning coffee and read it twice before calling for his carriage. The letter claimed to be from a solicitor in the northern counties, stating that Elena Whitmore had been secretly engaged for over a year to a man named Lord Henry Vane, a minor nobleman known more for his debts than his charm. The letter suggested that Elena's sudden favor with the Duke was nothing more than a calculated scheme to escape a prior commitment she found beneath her ambitions, and that the Duke would do well to inquire further before proceeding with any courtship. The Duke did not believe it, not entirely, but a rumor like that, once released into society, did not need to be believed to cause damage. It only needed to be repeated. By the time he arrived at the Whitmore house that afternoon, the story had already reached 3 drawing rooms and a card game at the home of Lady Pemberton, one of the most enthusiastic gossips in the county. Elena knew none of this yet. She was in the garden, cutting late roses for the table, when a servant informed her that the Duke had arrived and wished to speak with her privately. She found him standing near the front hall, his expression carefully controlled in a way that told her immediately something was wrong. "Your Grace," she said, "has something happened?" "Do you know a man named Lord Henry Vane?" he asked, watching her face closely as he said it. Elena frowned. "I have met him perhaps twice at gatherings with my sister Clara. He courted her briefly 2 years ago before her interest moved elsewhere. Why do you ask?" The Duke exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "A letter arrived this morning claiming you have been secretly engaged to him for over a year." Elena's hands went still on the rose stem she was holding. "That is not true. I have never been engaged to anyone, and certainly not to Lord Vane." "I believed as much," the Duke said. "But belief and proof are different things, and by tonight, half the county will have heard the claim, regardless of whether it holds any truth." Elena's mind moved quickly, sorting through the pieces. A letter arriving so precisely, so soon after the ball, naming a man connected specifically to her sister rather than to her. It did not take long to arrive at the only explanation that made sense. Clara, she said quietly, you believe your own sister wrote this. I believe she knows Lord Vane well enough to arrange it, whether she wrote it herself or paid him to claim it, Elinor said. He has debts, does he not? Debts large enough that a small sum of money might convince him to sign his name to something untrue. The Duke's jaw tightened. If that is true, it is a serious accusation, and one that could ruin more than just this courtship if it becomes known. Then we must prove it false, Elinor said, surprising herself with how steady her voice remained. She had spent years being the quiet one, the one who absorbed rather than acted. Something about watching her family's schemes threaten the one good thing that had ever happened to her burned away the old habit entirely. How do you propose we do that? The Duke asked. Lord Vane is not a clever man, Elinor said. He is a desperate one. Desperate men make mistakes when pressed. If we confront him directly and quickly before Clara has time to prepare him further, I believe he will crack. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind his careful expression. You have clearly given this more thought in the last 30 seconds than most men give to an entire strategy of war. I have spent years learning how my family thinks, Elinor said. It is not a skill I am proud of, but it may finally be useful for something. They found Lord Henry Vane that same evening at a gaming house on the edge of town, a place known for attracting men whose fortunes had already slipped through their fingers once and were now trying, unsuccessfully, to claw them back. He sat at a card table with a nearly empty glass at his elbow, and when he looked up to see the Duke of Ashford standing over him, the color drained from his face so quickly it was almost comical. Your Grace, he said, rising unsteadily, I did not expect. No, the Duke said. I imagine you did not expect to be found quite so quickly. Lord Vane's eyes darted toward Elinor, standing slightly behind the Duke, and something in his expression confirmed everything she had already suspected. I believe you know why we are here, the Duke said, his voice low and even, carrying none of the anger Elinor could see building behind his eyes. A letter arrived this morning claiming a secret engagement between yourself and Miss Whitmore. I would like to hear, directly from you, whether that claim is true. Lord Vane's throat worked visibly as he swallowed. Your Grace, Before you answer, the Duke said, you should know that I have already sent word to my solicitor, requesting a full accounting of your current debts, your recent transactions, and any sums of money that have passed into your accounts in the last week. I expect that report within 2 days. If your answer tonight does not match what that report reveals, the consequences will be considerably worse for you than a simple admission would be now. Lord Vane's composure crumbled entirely. He sank back into his chair, his hands trembling slightly around the empty glass. It was Miss Clara Whitmore, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She came to me 4 days ago with an offer, a sum of money, enough to settle my most pressing debts, in exchange for signing a statement claiming an engagement that never existed. Why would she want such a thing? The Duke asked, though Elinor suspected he already knew the answer. She said her sister had stolen something that was owed to her, Lord Vane said. She did not explain further, only that the engagement needed to appear to have existed for at least a year, so that your courtship would seem improper, even scandalous, should it continue. Elinor felt something cold settle in her chest, not quite surprise, but a confirmation of something she had long suspected without ever having proof. Her sister had not simply mocked her out of habit or boredom. Margaret and Clara had built their entire understanding of the world around the belief that Elinor existed to serve their interests, and any attempt by Elinor to claim something for herself, even something as simple as being noticed by a good man, was treated as theft. I will need that statement in writing, the Duke said to Lord Vane. Signed and witnessed, confirming everything you have just told us. In exchange, I will not pursue further action against you for your part in this, though I strongly suggest you consider leaving the county before your debts and your reputation catch up with you entirely. Lord Vane nodded quickly, already reaching for paper and ink with the desperate speed of a man who understood he had been given a mercy he did not deserve. The signed statement was delivered to Ashford House within the hour, and by the following morning the Duke had ensured, through careful and quiet conversations with the very same gossips who had spread the original rumor, that the truth reached exactly as many drawing rooms as the lie had. Alina learned of Clara's confrontation with their mother secondhand, through a servant who had overheard raised voices behind a closed door. Apparently, Lady Whitmore had been horrified to learn what her eldest daughter had arranged, not out of any deep concern for Alina's reputation, but out of fear that the scheme's failure would reflect badly on the family's standing with a duke who had considerable influence over half the county's business dealings. When Alina finally saw Clara again, 2 days later, her sister's face had lost none of its beauty, but had gained something harder underneath it, a resentment that no longer bothered to hide itself behind polite smiles. "You have ruined everything," Clara said, cornering Alina in the hallway outside the drawing room. "Do you understand what you have taken from me?" "I have taken nothing from you," Alina said, and she was surprised by how calm her own voice sounded, how little her sister's anger moved her now. "You tried to destroy something that belonged to me, and it did not work. That is not the same as me taking something from you." "You were never supposed to have anything," Clara hissed. "You were supposed to stay exactly where you were, quiet, useful, and out of the way. Now the entire county is speaking of you as though you are somehow remarkable, and I am left explaining why my own sister needed to scheme her way into a title she never deserved." "I did not scheme for anything," Alina said. "I wrote a letter 3 years ago because it was the right thing to do, long before I ever imagined it would matter to anyone. If the Duke has chosen to notice that, it is not because I manipulated him. It is because you and Margaret spent so many years teaching me to expect nothing, that when someone finally offered me something honest, I recognized it immediately for what it was." Clara's mouth opened, then closed again, no clever response arriving quickly enough to soften the accusation. For the first time in Alina's memory, her sister looked, briefly, almost uncertain. "This is not over," Clara finally said, though the words carried less certainty than they once might have. "Mother will not allow this family's reputation to be dragged through gossip because of your ambitions." "My ambitions," Alina repeated quietly, "have never once included ruining anyone's life. I cannot say the same for you." She walked past her sister without waiting for a response, out into the garden where the late roses she had been cutting 3 days earlier still sat in a forgotten basket by the back door. She picked it up, carried it inside, and began arranging the flowers with steady, careful hands, and for the first time since the scheme had unraveled around her, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. She felt, quietly and without any need to announce it to anyone, victorious. That evening, the Duke called on her again, and this time there was no scandal waiting to interrupt them, no forged letter or desperate lord dragging them back into crisis. They sat together in the same garden where she had cut the roses, and he told her, with the same steady honesty that had first drawn her to trust him, that whatever her family threw at them in the days ahead, he did not intend to let it change his mind. "They will try again," Alina said. "My sisters do not give up easily." "Neither do I," the Duke said. "And I suspect, now that I have seen what you did with Lord Vane, that neither do you." Alina allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a small and genuine smile. "No," she said, "I do not believe I do." Margaret Whitmore was not a woman who accepted defeat easily, and the failure of Clara's scheme with Lord Vane did not discourage her. It simply taught her to be more careful. She began with information rather than lies, because she understood, better than her sister ever had, that the most dangerous weapon against a marriage was not a fabricated scandal but a true one, especially if it could be aimed at the right target. She spent a week quietly asking questions among the family's creditors, the estate's aging steward, and an old family friend who managed their remaining investments, and what she learned confirmed what she had long suspected but never fully understood. Their father's estate was drowning in debt. Years of poor investments, a failed venture in shipping, and Lord Whitmore's refusal to acknowledge the severity of the losses had brought the family to the edge of ruin. Within 2 years, without a significant change in fortune, they would lose the house entirely. Margaret understood immediately what this meant and how it could be used. She requested a private audience with the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, the Duke's aging mother, a woman known throughout society for her sharp mind and her deep protectiveness over her only son. Margaret arrived at the Dowager's townhouse dressed carefully, her manner arranged into exactly the kind of humble concern that had once fooled everyone who mattered. "Your Grace," Margaret said, once they were seated in the Dowager's private sitting room, "I come to you not out of malice toward my sister, but out of genuine worry for your son's future happiness." The Dowager Duchess regarded her with the calm, assessing patience of a woman who had spent decades listening to people attempt to manipulate her and had grown skilled at recognizing the shape of it before the words even finished forming. "Go on," she said simply. "My family's estate is in significant financial difficulty," Margaret said. "I do not say this to shame my father, but because I believe your son should understand the full truth before he commits himself further. My sister Eleanor knows of this difficulty. I fear her sudden and convenient favor with the Duke may be less about affection and more about securing her family's survival before it is too late." It was, Margaret knew, a clever half-truth. The estate's troubles were real. Eleanor's awareness of them was also real, in the vague way that any daughter might be aware of her family's tightening circumstances without fully understanding the numbers behind them. What Margaret left out, deliberately, was that Eleanor had never once mentioned the estate to the Duke, had never asked him for anything beyond his honest attention, and had in fact spent years being treated so poorly by her own family that securing their survival was very nearly the last thing on her mind. The Dowager Duchess was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled thoughtfully in her lap. "You are suggesting your sister's affection for my son is calculated." "I am suggesting," Margaret said carefully, "that it would be wise for someone in your position to look closely before any formal arrangement is made. I would hate to see your son's generosity taken advantage of." The Dowager Duchess studied Margaret for a long moment before speaking again. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, if your sister's affection for my son is truly calculated, as you suggest, why did she spend 3 years writing letters on behalf of tenant families she had never met, expecting nothing in return, long before she ever knew my son would take notice of her?" Margaret blinked, caught entirely off guard. "I do not understand your meaning." "My son told me everything," the Dowager Duchess said. "The letter, the tenant family, the years he spent quietly admiring the character of a woman he had never met before circumstance finally brought them together. I have also heard, through my own sources, precisely how your family has treated her in the years since that letter was written. I did not need your visit today to understand the shape of your family's difficulties, Miss Whitmore. I needed it only to understand the shape of your character." The color drained from Margaret's face, the careful arrangement of humble concern collapsing entirely under the weight of the Dowager's steady gaze. "Your Grace, I only meant—" "I know precisely what you meant," the Dowager Duchess said, rising from her chair in a manner that made clear the audience had ended. "You meant to protect your family's fortunes by attaching suspicion to your own sister, hoping that fear might succeed where scandal failed. I will tell you now, as clearly as I can, that it will not work. My son has already made his choice, and nothing you say in this room will unmake it." Margaret left the townhouse that afternoon with nothing gained and considerably more lost than she had arrived with, because word of her visit reached the Duke before she had even returned home. The Dowager Duchess, it turned out, was not a woman who kept such conversations to herself when they concerned her son's happiness. The Duke arrived at Ashford House that evening with an expression Alina had not yet seen on his face, a carefully restrained anger that seemed to sit just beneath his usual composure like a current beneath still water. "Your sister visited my mother today," he said, once they were alone in the garden where they had grown accustomed to speaking privately. "She suggested your affection for me has been calculated from the beginning, meant to secure your family's finances rather than born of genuine feeling." Alina felt something twist painfully in her chest, not surprise exactly, but a fresh wound layered over old ones. "I did not know our finances had grown so dire," she said quietly. "Margaret clearly knew more than I did and clearly saw an opportunity in it." "My mother did not believe her," the Duke said. "But I confess, hearing it repeated to me secondhand, even knowing the source, left a small doubt I am not proud of. I want you to understand that I trust you. I simply want to hear it from you directly, so the doubt does not have room to grow." Alina met his eyes steadily, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "I have never once asked you for anything beyond your honest attention," she said. "I did not know, until this very conversation, the true extent of my family's troubles. If I had known, I would have told you myself, because I have spent my entire life watching my sisters use secrets and half-truths as weapons, and I refuse to become someone who does the same, even to protect myself." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and whatever small doubt Margaret's visit had planted seemed to dissolve entirely under the weight of Alina's steady honesty. "I believe you," he said. "I believed you before you spoke, if I am honest. I only needed to hear it to be certain the doubt had nowhere left to hide." "What will you do?" Alina asked, "now that you know the truth about my family's finances?" "I will do what I would have done regardless," the Duke said. "I will marry you because I love you, not your family's circumstances. Whatever difficulties your father has created for himself, they are not yours to carry, and I do not intend to let your sisters use them as a weapon against either of us again." Alina felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the strange and overwhelming relief of being believed, fully and completely, by someone who had every reason to doubt her and chose not to. "There is one more thing," the Duke said, his expression shifting into something more serious. "I intend to speak with your father directly about the estate's difficulties and about a proposal I have been considering, not out of obligation, but because I do not wish to see you carry the weight of your family's failures into our marriage, watching them slowly lose everything while you stand by unable to help." "What kind of proposal?" Alina asked, uncertain. "I intend to offer your father a loan," the Duke said, "structured carefully, with conditions that will require him to finally address the mismanagement that created this crisis in the first place. Not a gift, and not a rescue that allows the same mistakes to continue unchecked, but a genuine chance to correct course, under terms I will oversee personally." Alina stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You would do that, after everything my sisters have done to undermine you, to undermine us?" "I am not marrying your sisters," the Duke said simply. "I am marrying you, and I do not believe in punishing an entire family for the cruelty of two of its members, particularly when doing so would also punish you, and your father, who I understand has simply been too proud and too overwhelmed to admit how badly things had gone." The proposal, once presented to Lord Whitmore 2 days later, was met with a mixture of shame and profound relief. Alina's father, a man who had spent years avoiding difficult conversations about the estate's finances, finally sat down with the Duke's own solicitor and began, for the first time, to face the numbers honestly. Margaret, upon learning of the arrangement, retreated into a silence that lasted for days, the calculating brightness in her eyes replaced by something duller, something closer to defeat. Whatever leverage she had hoped to gain by exposing the family's troubles had been entirely dismantled, not by anger or retaliation, but by the Duke's quiet insistence on doing what was right regardless of what her scheme had intended. Clara, for her part, seemed to withdraw from the entire conflict, spending more time away from the house, less interested in confronting a sister she could no longer diminish, and increasingly aware that the family's old order, in which she and Margaret had always stood above Alina, had shifted permanently and would not shift back. Alina stood in the garden that evening, watching the last of the autumn light fade behind the hedges, and allowed herself, finally, to imagine a future that did not require her to disappear into corners or absorb the cruelty of people who should have loved her better. The wedding had not yet happened, and there would likely be more difficulties before it did, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alina Whitmore felt something steady beneath her feet that she recognized, with quiet astonishment as hope. The morning of the wedding, a stranger arrived at the church gates claiming to be a witness to a crime that had never happened. Alina heard about it from a breathless maid who burst into the small dressing room where she was having the final pins set into her hair. "There is a man outside," the maid said, "telling anyone who will listen that Miss Alina Whitmore stole money from a household she once served in, years ago, before the family knew her at all." Alina's hands went cold, though her expression remained steady. She had learned over the past months that panic solved nothing, and that the truth, when calmly presented, was almost always stronger than any lie built to oppose it. "Bring the man to me," she said, quietly, before he causes more disruption than he already has. The maid hesitated. "Miss Whitmore, it is your wedding day. Surely someone else should handle this." "There is no one better suited to handle it than myself," Alina said. "I know exactly what I have and have not done in my life. Whoever this man is, he does not." The stranger was brought to a small side room off the church, a nervous-looking man in a worn coat who would not meet Alina's eyes when she entered. She recognized, almost immediately, the particular kind of desperation in his posture, the look of someone paid to say words he did not fully believe himself. "You claim I stole money from a household I served in," Alina said without preamble. "Which household? What year? What was taken and from whom?" The man's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced toward the door as though hoping someone might rescue him from having to answer. "I do not require your name," Alina continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "I require details. A true accusation carries details easily. A false one collapses the moment someone asks for them." "I was told only to say the words," the man finally admitted, his shoulders sinking. "A woman paid me 2 days ago near the market square. She did not give her name. She gave me coin, and she gave me the sentence I was to repeat loudly near the church this morning." "Describe her," Alina said. The description that followed matched Margaret so precisely that Alina felt no surprise at all, only a tired, familiar sadness that her sister had chosen, even now, on this particular morning, to make one final attempt at destruction, rather than accept that the war had already ended. "Thank you for your honesty," Alina said to the man. "You will not be punished for this, provided you leave now and do not repeat the claim to anyone else. If you do, I will ensure the magistrate hears of the coin you accepted for spreading lies, and the consequences will fall on you rather than the woman who paid you." The man left quickly, visibly relieved, and Alina stood alone in the small side room for a long moment, gathering herself before returning to the dressing room where her wedding gown waited. She found Margaret in the hallway outside, clearly waiting to see whether the scheme had taken hold, her expression carefully arranged into innocent concern the moment she saw Alina approaching. "I heard there was some disturbance at the gates," Margaret said. "I do hope it did not upset you, on today of all days." "It did not upset me," Alina said. "It disappointed me, though I confess I am not entirely surprised. I did not expect you to simply accept defeat, even on the morning of my wedding." Margaret's careful expression cracked, just slightly, the way ice cracks under weight it was never built to hold. "I do not know what you are suggesting." I spoke with the man you paid, Elinor said quietly. He described you precisely, coin and all. I have already told him the consequences of repeating your lie elsewhere, and I have chosen not to bring this to the Duke, or to our mother, or to anyone at all beyond this hallway, because I do not wish this day to be remembered for your cruelty rather than for what it should be remembered for. Margaret's eyes widened slightly, some mixture of fear and disbelief passing across her face. You are simply going to forgive this, after everything. I did not say I forgive you, Elinor said. I said I am choosing not to punish you further because I am done spending my energy on your schemes. You have tried 3 times now to take something from me that was never yours to take, and 3 times you have failed. I do not need a 4th attempt to prove what I already know, which is that nothing you do will change the choice this man made, or the choice I have made in return. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, staring at her sister with an expression that had finally, entirely, run out of clever responses. Something in her posture shifted, not quite remorse, but perhaps the first genuine crack in years of careful cruelty. I do not know how to be anything other than what I have always been, Margaret finally said, quietly, almost to herself. Then perhaps, Elinor said, today is as good a day as any to begin learning. She left her sister standing in the hallway and returned to the dressing room, where the maid finished the final pins in her hair with hands that trembled slightly from having witnessed, second-hand, the strange, quiet strength her mistress had just displayed. The wedding itself proceeded without further disruption. Elinor walked down the aisle of Ashford's small stone church past rows of guests who had once whispered about her ruined dress and her family's cruelty, and who now watched her with an entirely different kind of attention, the kind reserved for someone whose story had become, against every expectation, remarkable. The Duke waited for her at the altar, his expression carrying none of the careful composure he wore in public matters, replaced instead by something open and unguarded that Elinor had only ever seen in private moments between them. When she reached him, he took her hand, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely safe. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and quiet joy, and when it ended, when the Duke finally called her his wife in front of everyone who had once overlooked her, Elinor felt something settle inside her chest that she recognized as the last of the old fear, finally releasing its grip. At the wedding breakfast that followed, Lord Whitmore approached his daughter with an expression she had rarely seen on his face, something close to genuine shame mixed with pride he did not quite know how to express. "I have not been the father you deserved," he said quietly. "I allowed your sisters to treat you poorly for years, telling myself it was simply the way sisters behaved when I should have known better. I am sorry, Elinor, truly." "Thank you for saying so," Elinor said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant the forgiveness in her voice. "I would like to believe we can build something better from here, if you are willing to try." "I am," her father said. "The Duke's arrangement regarding the estate has forced me to look honestly at mistakes I spent years avoiding. I do not know if I can undo the damage of the past, but I intend to try, starting now." Clara approached later, quieter than usual, her earlier brightness replaced by something more thoughtful. "I do not know if I deserve your kindness," she said, "but I am glad, truly, that you have found happiness. I have spent a long time believing that my beauty and Margaret's cleverness were the only things that mattered in this family, and watching you these past months has made me wonder if I missed something important in believing that." "You are welcome to discover what that something is," Elinor said. "There is time yet if you wish to look for it." Margaret did not approach at all, though Elinor caught her watching from across the room more than once, her expression unreadable, something working behind her eyes that Elinor suspected might take considerably longer than a single wedding day to resolve. It did not trouble her as it once might have. She had learned over the past months that she was no longer responsible for carrying her sister's unhappiness alongside her own joy. As the afternoon light slanted golden through the tall windows of Ashford House, Alina stood beside her husband, watching the guests mingle and the servants move quietly among them. And she thought back to the girl who had stood in this very hall months earlier, drenched in punch and shame, expecting nothing from the evening but another quiet humiliation to absorb. That girl had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who understood, finally and completely, that her worth had never depended on her sister's approval, or her family's opinion, or even the Duke's attention, though she was deeply grateful for all three turning in her favor in the end. Her worth had always been there, quiet and steady, waiting for someone, including herself, to finally notice it. "You are thinking very seriously for a woman on her wedding day," the Duke said softly, his hand finding hers. "I am thinking," Alina said, "about how far a single letter, written 3 years ago by a girl who expected nothing in return, managed to carry me." "It carried you exactly as far as your own character deserved," the Duke said. "I merely happened to be paying attention when it arrived." Alina smiled, and outside the tall windows, the last of the autumn light spread golden across the gardens where her whole life had quietly begun to change. And she understood, with the calm certainty of someone who had finally stopped waiting for permission to be happy, that whatever difficulties still lay ahead, she would face them not as the family's afterthought, but as exactly who she had always been underneath the years of quiet endurance. Someone strong enough to be seen, and finally, someone who was.